Begin. Imagine a time when a vast empire, built on the backs of conquered peoples, fabricated a legal document to solidify its iron grip. Not a decree born of conquest, but a carefully constructed illusion, a legal sleight of hand designed to legitimize theft and oppression. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of history's most audacious deceptions. The British Act of 1858, presented as a benign transfer of power, but in reality, a brazen power grab that stripped India's kings of their sovereignty and paved the way for decades of brutal colonial rule. We've all heard of the British Raj, the period of direct British rule over India, but the narrative often presented is one of benevolent administration, of bringing order and progress. This couldn't be further from the truth. The year 1858 wasn't a turning point of shared governance. It was the year Britain legally rewrote the rules of the game, not for India's benefit, but for its own insatiable appetite for power and profit. Let's rewind a moment. For over a century, India had been largely under the control of the British East India Company. This wasn't a government in the traditional sense, but a private corporation, funded by shareholders, that had amassed immense military and administrative power through treaties, wars, and sheer exploitation. They controlled vast territories, levied taxes, and even waged wars. But by the mid-19th century, their grip was starting to slip. The seeds of resistance were sown, culminating in the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, a widespread rebellion against the company's oppressive policies. The mutiny, though ultimately suppressed, sent shockwaves through London. The British government, which had long been uneasy about the East India Company's immense, unaccountable power, saw an opportunity. They presented themselves as the saviors, the forces of stability stepping in to restore order. And to do so, they needed a legal framework. This is where the Government of India Act of 1858, the very act we're discussing, comes into play. Now, this act is often portrayed as a simple transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown. A legitimate transition, you might think, but let's dissect this. The act didn't transfer power, it confiscated it. It didn't restore sovereignty, it annihilated it. It was a legal fiction, a piece of legislation crafted in Westminster, thousands of miles away, to justify direct, unquestioned British dominion over the Indian subcontinent. What did this act actually do? Firstly, it officially dissolved the British East India Company. Its charter, its armies, its administrative machinery, all were absorbed by the British Crown. This might sound like tidying up, but it was the final nail in the coffin of any pretense of Indian autonomy that might have lingered under the company's rule. The company, for all its flaws, had at least operated under a charter, a quasi-legal document. The Crown, however, answered to no one but its own imperial ambitions. Secondly, and crucially, it declared that India was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty the Queen. This meant that the existing Indian rulers, the Maharajas, the Nizams, the Nawabs, the kings who had once held sovereign power within their own domains, were now subservient to the British monarch. Their authority was no longer inherent. It was granted and could be revoked by the Queen. How did they achieve this? Through a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. The act didn't negotiate with these rulers, it dictated to them. It didn't seek consent, it imposed its will. The vast territories controlled by various Indian princely states, some of which had existed for centuries, were now declared to be under British paramountcy. This meant that Britain held ultimate authority, and any treaty or agreement with these Indian rulers was now subject to British interpretation and approval. Let's look at the language. The act stated that India shall be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty. This is not the language of partnership or mutual respect. It is the language of ownership. It's as if a landlord, after allowing a tenant to manage a property for years, decides to kick the tenant out and then announce that the property has always belonged to them and they will now be taking over personally. Think about the specific mechanisms. Before 1858, the East India Company had engaged in a complex web of treaties with Indian rulers. Some were alliances, some were subsidiary alliances that effectively made these rulers client states, but there was still a semblance of independent existence for many. The 1858 Act, however, through the doctrine of lapse and the assertion of paramountcy, effectively nullified these existing arrangements. Britain claimed the right to intervene in the internal affairs of any Indian state, to depose rulers, to annex territories, all under the guise of good governance, or preventing misrule. One of the most insidious aspects of this legal trickery was the concept of paramountcy itself. This wasn't a legal term that existed in Indian jurisprudence. It was a British imposition, a unilateral declaration that Britain's authority superseded all other authority within India. This allowed them to dictate succession, to control foreign policy, to demand military support, and to interfere in matters of justice and administration, all while maintaining the facade of respecting Indian rulers. Consider the case of the Maharaja of Indore. Before 1858, the Holkar rulers had a degree of autonomy. After 1858, their destiny was directly tied to the whims of the British Crown. Similarly, the Nizam of Hyderabad, one of the wealthiest rulers in India, found his powers significantly curtailed. The act essentially created a hierarchical structure where the British Crown sat at the apex, and all Indian rulers were relegated to dependent positions. Furthermore, the act established a new administrative structure. A Secretary of State for India was appointed, sitting in London, responsible for the governance of India. This individual, accountable only to the British Parliament, held immense power. The Viceroy, the Queen's representative in India, became the chief executive. This centralized control from London was a deliberate move to ensure that India's wealth and resources were exploited for the benefit of the British Empire, not for the development of India itself. The economic implications were staggering. The act facilitated the systematic extraction of India's wealth. Indian revenues were used to fund British wars, to pay for British administrators, and to build infrastructure that primarily served British trade interests. Indian industries were deliberately suppressed to prevent competition with British manufacturers. This wasn't economic development, it was economic drain. The narrative of the 1858 Act being a positive step for India is a carefully constructed myth. It was a legal weapon forged to legitimize continued subjugation. It enabled Britain to dismantle any remaining vestiges of Indian self-rule, to extract resources with impunity, and to impose its will without challenge. Let's be clear, the Sepoy Mutiny was a cry of pain, a desperate attempt by Indians to resist the suffocating grip of foreign rule. The British response, embodied in the 1858 Act, wasn't a healing balm. It was the tightening of the chains. It was a calculated move to transform a de facto colonial power into a de jure imperial one, using the language of law to mask the reality of oppression. The impact of this act resonated for nearly a century. It shaped the lives of millions, dictating policies, drawing borders, and perpetuating a system of inequality that continues to have echoes today. It wasn't just a change in administration. It was a declaration of permanent dominion, a unilateral pronouncement that Britain, through a stroke of a pen in 1858, was now the undeniable master of India's destiny. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a partnership. This was the legal codification of conquest. The British Empire, facing internal dissent and a growing understanding of the injustices it was perpetrating, didn't reform itself. It rebranded itself. It took the existing exploitation, the existing subjugation, and wrapped it in the veneer of legal legitimacy. It was a bold, audacious act of deception, designed to convince the world, and perhaps even themselves, that they were ruling India with the consent of the governed, when in reality they were ruling over them with a forged decree. What does this tell us about power? It tells us that power isn't always wielded through brute force alone. Sometimes, the most effective tools are legal fictions, carefully crafted legislation that distorts reality and justifies injustice. The 1858 Act is a stark reminder that the language of law can be twisted to serve the interests of the oppressor, and that historical narratives can be spun to mask the uncomfortable truths of imperial ambition. When we look at 1858, we see not a moment of transition, but a deliberate act of subjugation, cloaked in the guise of legality. It was Britain's fake act to rule India's kings, and its legacy is a testament to the enduring power of historical deception. The question we must ask ourselves is, when does the fiction of law become the undeniable reality of oppression? And